In the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, everything appeared picture perfect. Rows of identical beige houses lined the curving streets, manicured lawns were trimmed to regulation height, and mailboxes stood at uniform angles like obedient soldiers. It was a neighborhood obsessed with appearances, not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear of the HOA. For most residents, the Homeowners Association was more powerful than local law enforcement. They dictated what colors you could paint your house, what plants were acceptable, and even how long your trash cans could sit at the curb. The HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, though everyone just called her Karen behind her back, ruled the neighborhood with an iron clipboard. When I first moved in, I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to own a home, a modest single story with a large oak tree shading the front yard. I enjoyed the peace, the stillness, the sense that nothing ever really changed here. But that illusion shattered one Thursday morning when I opened my mailbox and found an official-looking envelope from the Maplewood Heights HOA. At first, I thought it was another monthly newsletter or one of those endless notices about community improvements. But this one was different. The letterhead was bold, stamped with the HOA seal, and the language inside was firm, cold even. It stated that my mailbox was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. I blinked at the paper, confused. My mailbox was just a mailbox. Black metal standing straight, not damaged or crooked. It had been there since the house was built 20 years ago. But apparently, according to the HOA, it wasn't elegant enough. They demanded I replace it with an approved design from their list, a white post with decorative trim in a bronze box, costing nearly $400. It was absurd, especially since several houses down the street still had mismatched or weathered boxes. But those belonged to board members or their friends, people Patricia liked. The letter ended with a threat failure to comply within 30 days would result in fines. At first, I laughed it off, tossing the paper onto my kitchen counter. Surely it was just a misunderstanding. I'd send an email, explain that my mailbox was perfectly fine, and they'd drop it. But when I reached out, the response I received was curt and dismissive. They appreciated my concern, but expected full compliance. That's when it began, the quiet irritation that would soon grow into something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the small hypocrisies everywhere. Patricia's own mailbox had a crack down the side and peeling paint, yet no notice was posted there. Her vice president's yard was overgrown with ivy, yet no one complained. It was clear that the HOA's rules weren't about aesthetics. They were about control. By the second week, another letter came. This one was more aggressive. It stated that if I didn't replace my mailbox immediately, I'd face escalating fines and a possible hearing. They included a photo of my property. Someone had walked right up to my home to take it. The invasive nature of it made my skin crawl. That was when something inside me shifted. I could have just bought the stupid, elegant mailbox and been done with it. But that wasn't the point anymore. It wasn't about compliance. It was about standing up to a system that bullied people into submission under the guise of neighborhood standards. So I decided I wouldn't just keep my mailbox. I'd make it unforgettable. I spent days sketching designs, looking up custom metalwork, exploring paint finishes and lighting ideas. If the HOA wanted elegant, I'd give them something far beyond their narrow imagination, something that would redefine what elegant even meant. Neighbors began whispering as I took measurements and ordered supplies. Some warned me that going against Patricia was social suicide in Maplewood Heights. Others secretly cheered me on, fed up with her authoritarian style but too afraid to resist openly. One afternoon, Patricia herself stopped by while I was digging near the curb. She didn't say a word, just stood there, arms crossed, her judging eyes flicking from my tools to the ground. The tension hung thick in the air until she turned on her heel and marched away, her silence saying more than words ever could. That night, I stayed up late reviewing my plans. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was art, rebellion, and symbolism all at once. I envisioned a towering post made from reclaimed oak, hand-carved vines wrapping around it, topped with a sleek, modern metal box engraved with my street number. Solar lights would illuminate it at night, casting a soft glow across the sidewalk. It would be functional, beautiful, and utterly unique. By the time the 30-day deadline arrived, I was ready. The next morning I installed it, the centerpiece of my property, standing tall and gleaming under the morning sun. Passersby slowed their cars just to look. Neighbors stepped out of their homes to stare. It wasn't gaudy or outrageous. It was simply remarkable. And within 24 hours, the HOA lost its mind. They sent another letter, this time accusing me of defacing the neighborhood's uniform aesthetic. They demanded its immediate removal, calling it unapproved and disruptive to community harmony. But this time I didn't respond. I let them stew. Because the funny thing was, I had followed their rules. The mailbox met every technical requirement. Correct height, distance from the curb, even the approved color scheme. The only thing wrong with it was that it stood out. The HOA wasn't prepared for someone who knew their rulebook better than they did. As word spread, people began visiting from other parts of town just to see it. A local blogger even posted about the most beautiful mailbox in Maplewood, and the post gained traction online. Suddenly, my defiance became something of a legend. The HOA, embarrassed by the attention, doubled down. They scheduled a disciplinary hearing, claiming my mailbox had caused visual disruption. But I had evidence, community support, and a newfound determination they couldn't bully away. The mailbox that started as a simple act of rebellion had already become something bigger, a symbol of resistance in a neighborhood suffocated by control. And as I prepared for the upcoming hearing, I realized something profound. They wanted conformity. I'd given them art, and that was their biggest fear. The notice for the disciplinary hearing arrived on a crisp Monday morning, printed on thick paper and sealed with the HOA's embossed emblem like it was some kind of royal decree. The tone was predictably condescending. Attendance mandatory. Failure to appear may result in further penalties, and other phrases meant to intimidate. It was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, that sterile beige building where residents pretended to enjoy potlucks and mandatory meetings. By the time Thursday rolled around, the mailbox had become a full-blown neighborhood attraction. Cars slowed every few minutes, pedestrians stopped to take photos, and whispers floated through the cul-de-sac like wildfire. Patricia, the self-appointed queen of Maplewood Heights, was seething. Every approving comment about my mailbox was a direct hit to her fragile sense of control. That evening, I arrived at the clubhouse with a quiet confidence. The air inside was thick with tension, the faint scent of coffee and printer toner mixing with the artificial politeness of HOA politics. At the front table sat Patricia and the board members, their nameplates arranged neatly like they were presiding over a courtroom. A projector screen behind them displayed the HOA bylaws in microscopic text, a tool they used to intimidate anyone foolish enough to challenge them. The meeting began with routine nonsense, noise complaints, fence disputes, lawn citations. My name was last on the docket, and by the time they called me up, every eye in the room was on me. Patricia adjusted her glasses, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. She began by outlining the nature of the violation, projecting a photo of my mailbox on the screen. It looked magnificent, even under the harsh fluorescent light, but Patricia's voice dripped with disdain as she described it as non-conforming, visually intrusive, and contrary to community harmony. I stood silently, letting her speak, her words echoing in the room. She cited rules about design uniformity, but I noticed something immediately. She skipped the sections about creative variance and aesthetic freedom, small loopholes that allowed for unique designs if they met basic safety and structural guidelines. I knew them well because I had studied every line of the HOA manual before I even began building. When she finally finished her theatrical presentation, I calmly presented my evidence, a printed copy of the regulations with the relevant passages highlighted, along with a stack of signatures from neighbors who supported the new design. The room shifted. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia's smug confidence faltered, but she recovered quickly, claiming the signatures were irrelevant, and the rules were being interpreted incorrectly. But the damage was done. The audience, a mix of curious residents and silent rebels, saw what she was doing. She wasn't protecting the community's beauty, she was protecting her authority. The hearing dragged on for over an hour. The board debated in circles, but I never lost my composure. When the meeting finally adjourned, they announced they would deliberate privately and notify me of their decision in writing. I left the room feeling oddly calm, win or lose. I had exposed their hypocrisy in front of everyone, and that was already a victory. Over the following days, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. Neighbors began greeting me more openly, offering words of encouragement when Patricia wasn't watching. A few even started adding small decorative touches to their own mailboxes. Nothing major, but subtle acts of defiance. Then, the letter arrived. It was short and brutal. The board had unanimously determined that my mailbox was in violation of community standards. They demanded its removal within 10 days or I'd face daily fines and potential legal action. For a moment, anger flared through me. But then something unexpected happened. I laughed. Because by that point, the mailbox had already become too famous to destroy. A local real estate blogger had published an article titled, "The Mailbox Making Maplewood Famous," complete with photos and a snarky line about HOAs hating creativity. It spread faster than wildfire, shared on social media pages across town. Within a week, it reached the local news. A reporter called me for a short interview, and though I didn't name names, I made it clear that the HOA was trying to suppress individuality. Patricia was livid. The board called an emergency meeting. Not to discuss community improvement, but to discuss me. They accused me of bringing negative attention to Maplewood Heights. But it was too late. The attention had already drawn outsiders to the neighborhood, people driving through just to see the legendary mailbox. Some even left small decorative trinkets near the post. Tiny garden gnomes, painted rocks, and flowers. It had become a landmark in every sense. The HOA doubled down, issuing fines daily, each one more absurd than the last. I ignored them. I knew their threats were mostly empty, unenforceable unless they pursued legal action, which they couldn't afford without risking their nonprofit status. So I waited. And as I waited, I started gathering information. I dug into public records, board meeting minutes, and financial filings. What I found was explosive. The HOA had been using funds collected from fines to pay for administrative bonuses and beautification retreats. Patricia had even approved reimbursements to herself for community expenses that turned out to be personal purchases. The hypocrisy was staggering. I knew then that my mailbox fight was only the beginning, because if Patricia wanted a war over elegance, I was about to show her what true exposure looked like. And the best part, I had all the evidence I needed to turn her own rules against her. The HOA had always operated under a veil of quiet authority, a kind of suburban dictatorship that thrived on compliance and fear. But after the mailbox scandal went viral, that veil started to crack. For years, residents had muttered about Patricia's heavy-handed leadership, but no one had ever dared to challenge her outright. Now, for the first time, people began to whisper in open daylight. The more I dug into the HOA's records, the clearer the picture became. Patricia had been running the organization like her personal kingdom. Funds meant for landscaping and community upkeep were being redirected into vague administrative expenditures. Monthly reports were padded with suspicious line items. Consulting fees, board retreats, community engagement events that never actually happened. I spent hours late into the night at my desk, surrounded by piles of paperwork and coffee cups. Every document told a story. Every receipt left a trail. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was manipulation on a grand scale. It turned out that Patricia's house had also received special maintenance allowances for front yard landscaping, money that came directly from HOA funds. Her garden wasn't just pristine by effort, it was paid for by everyone else's fines. The discovery fueled something inside me. What had started as a petty argument about a mailbox had transformed into a mission. Patricia had wielded her power to shame, intimidate, and profit, and I was determined to make sure the entire neighborhood saw the truth. The key was timing. If I revealed everything too soon, she would twist it, play the victim, and bury the story under more bureaucratic noise. I needed to let her overplay her hand first, so I stayed quiet. I let her think she had won. The fines continued to arrive, each one more desperate than the last. The board started threatening legal action, but their tone had shifted. Their letters were no longer confident, they were nervous, almost frantic. Meanwhile, the media coverage didn't die down. The mailbox became a local landmark, and weekend visitors came by to take selfies beside it. Some even left donation envelopes addressed to the artist who defied the OA. Then came the breaking point. Patricia, in an act of desperation, announced an emergency community clean-up day, a thinly veiled attempt to tear down the mailbox under the guise of maintenance. She rallied a few loyal board members and posted notices on every door, claiming the mailbox was causing safety concerns. But what she didn't realize was that every move she made was being watched, not just by me, but by dozens of residents who were tired of her tyranny. When cleanup day arrived, a crowd gathered. Patricia showed up in her wide-brimmed hat, clipboard in hand, radiating self-importance. She motioned toward my yard like a general pointing to an enemy fort. But before she could issue an order, half the neighborhood stepped in. People she'd bullied for years stood their ground, blocking her path. Cameras were recording from every angle. She tried to argue, but her voice trembled under the pressure. Her carefully curated authority began to crumble as neighbors shouted about unfair fines, unexplained dues, and secretive meetings. That was the moment I had been waiting for. The next morning, I sent everything I had, every receipt, every expense report, every falsified budget entry, to the local news station that had covered the Mailbox story. Within 48 hours, the headline hit the front page, "Cho President Under Fire for Financial Misconduct." It was explosive. The community erupted. People demanded an emergency election. Patricia tried to dismiss the reports as misinterpretations, but the evidence was overwhelming. Screenshots of documents circulated on social media, and residents who had once stayed silent began coming forward with their own stories. The HOA headquarters, the same beige clubhouse where she once reigned supreme, became the site of chaos. Meetings that were once dull and quiet now buzzed with outrage and demands for change. Patricia tried to hold on, but the walls were closing in. The local news did a follow-up segment showing my now iconic mailbox gleaming proudly under the afternoon sun. The same mailbox that had started her downfall. The story wasn't just about art anymore, it had become a symbol of resistance against petty authority. Within a week, Patricia resigned. Her final statement was a mess of excuses and deflections, claiming she was stepping down for personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. She had been exposed, stripped of her power by the very neighbor she tried to humiliate. When the board announced her resignation, the room erupted in applause. For the first time, the community felt united. But while Patricia was gone, the HOA itself wasn't. And as the dust settled, I realized that taking her down was only half the battle. The system she built, the rules she twisted, still stood. And now I had the chance to rebuild it. The neighbors approached me after the meeting, one by one, asking if I'd consider running for the board. At first, I laughed. The idea of joining the very institution I'd fought against felt absurd. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If you want to change something rotten, sometimes you have to dig your hands into the dirt yourself. And that's exactly what I intended to do. After Patricia's resignation, the neighborhood of Maplewood Heights felt like it was waking up from a long and restless sleep. For years, the residents had lived under her strict and often arbitrary rule, and now, without her iron hand guiding every petty decision, things felt eerily quiet. The HOA, once feared, suddenly seemed aimless. Meetings were postponed, enforcement slowed, and the mailbox fines that had once flooded mailboxes came to a stop. But the calm didn't last long. The HOA still had to function, bills had to be paid, maintenance scheduled, and new leadership chosen. A temporary board was formed, made up of the few members who hadn't been directly implicated in Patricia's financial mess. They were overwhelmed, disorganized, and desperate for direction. That's when my name began circulating again. At first, I resisted the idea. I had fought this system because of how broken it was, not because I wanted to lead it. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Leaving the HOA in the hands of people too timid or too inexperienced to fix, it would only allow another Patricia to rise again. The system needed a complete overhaul, and I was the only one with both the motivation and the community's trust to do it. So, after some encouragement from my neighbors, I announced my candidacy for HOA president. The election turned out to be one of the most attended community events in Maplewood Heights history. The same people who had once rolled their eyes at HOA meetings now packed the clubhouse, eager for change. When the results were finally announced, there wasn't even a need for a recount. The vote was nearly unanimous. I had gone from being the neighborhood troublemaker to its leader. My first goal was simple transparency. I released every financial record the HOA had, all the dues, expenditures, and pending projects, and made them publicly accessible online. For the first time, people could see where their money was going. The reaction was overwhelming. Residents who had once been hostile toward the HOA started attending meetings with ideas, suggestions, and a genuine desire to help. The second step was reform. The bylaws Patricia had written were designed to control, not to serve. They gave the board too much power and the residents too little voice. I worked with a small team of volunteers to rewrite them from scratch. Every rule was debated, voted on, and simplified. Gone were the obscure fines and vague, aesthetic violations that had made the HOA infamous. The third goal, and perhaps the most symbolic, was to transform the OA's public image. Instead of being a tool for punishment, I wanted it to become a force for pride and unity. We started a neighborhood beautification initiative, weekend clean-up events, and seasonal festivals that celebrated creativity instead of suppressing it. And, of course, the first festival theme was community art. The event was a hit. Families came out with their kids to paint fences, plant flowers, and decorate sidewalks with chalk murals. The very place where the HOA once punished individuality was now alive with color, music, and laughter. Even the news returned to cover the transformation, running a follow-up piece titled, "From Control to Creativity, How One Homeowner Changed It All." But success didn't come without challenges. Not everyone was happy about the new direction. A small group of traditionalists, many of whom had supported Patricia, accused me of ruining the neighborhood's prestige. They believed the HOA's job was to maintain uniformity, not encourage self-expression. At first, their complaints were mild, snide remarks at meetings, passive-aggressive letters, and anonymous posts on community forums. But as the changes took root and the neighborhood's character evolved, their resentment grew. The most vocal of them was George, a long-time board member who had quietly benefited from Patricia's leadership. He argued that I was turning the HOA into a circus, undermining property values with uncontrolled creativity. He rallied a few of Patricia's old allies and began whispering about reinstating some of the old rules under the guise of stability. I could feel history threatening to repeat itself. The power struggles, the manipulation, the fear. It was all creeping back, just in different clothing. But I was no longer the outsider fighting from my driveway. I was the one sitting at the head of the table now, and I wasn't about to let Maplewood Heights slip backward. Instead of retaliating against George directly, I did something different. I invited him, and anyone else with grievances, to take part in an open, community forum night. No board formality, no rules of order, just neighbors talking to neighbors. Over 100 people showed up. The conversations were raw and emotional. Some were nostalgic for the old days, others furious about the corruption that had been exposed, but the majority stood by the new direction. By the end of the night, George's arguments had crumbled under the weight of public opinion. The residents had spoken, and they weren't going back. Still, his resistance left me uneasy. The HOA had survived one power-hungry leader, but corruption had deep roots. As much as I tried to reform it, there were still old debts, hidden favors, and unfinished business buried in the paperwork Patricia left behind. One evening, while reviewing the HOA archives in the clubhouse basement, I stumbled upon something strange. An old letter, yellowed with age, tucked into a binder of outdated contracts. It was a deed notice referencing reserved property rights, connected to a parcel of land near the neighborhood entrance. The name on the deed wasn't Patricia's. It was George's. He had ownership claims on a section of the neighborhood's common area, the same patch of land the HOA had been paying to maintain for years. That discovery changed everything. The corruption wasn't over. Patricia might have fallen, but her allies had been feasting on the same system in silence. And now, as the new HO president, I had the power and the responsibility to expose them all. Becoming president had given me access to everything: records, contracts, old meeting minutes, the entire paper trail of the OA's operations stretching back years. I had already uncovered Patricia's corruption, but what I found next made that scandal look like child's play. The deed I found in the dusty binder was legitimate. George, the same board member who had fought me tooth and nail over every reform, owned a small but critical section of land near the entrance to the neighborhood. It was labeled as a utility maintenance parcel, but the HOA had been maintaining it for over a decade. Mowing, landscaping, and even upgrading the signage, all paid for with residents' dues. At first, I assumed it was an error, maybe a clerical mistake or an oversight, but as I dug deeper, the truth came into focus. The mistake was intentional. Over a decade ago, George had been part of a land development committee that oversaw the early construction of Maplewood Heights. During that time, he quietly filed paperwork transferring ownership of the entrance lot to his own name under a limited holding company. The HOA, unaware of the change, continued to treat it as community property, Over the years, George had collected small reimbursements for maintenance costs, effectively charging the HOA, and all of us, to take care of land that legally belonged to him. It was the perfect crime. Small enough to avoid suspicion, long enough to fade into the background, and buried under enough paperwork that no one ever noticed. But now, I had noticed. The discovery set off a chain reaction in my mind. How much else had been hidden under the surface? How many routine expenses were actually schemes disguised as community service? I decided to audit every financial record the HOA had on file going back to the earliest digital logs. Days turned into weeks. My nights were spent surrounded by folders, receipts, and old board emails. Patterns began to emerge. George wasn't the only one. Patricia had funneled funds through her own projects, but she'd also helped others, quietly signing off on reimbursements and improvement contracts. That benefited a small group of loyal members. Landscaping invoices that didn't match any actual work, maintenance costs billed at double the market rate, and consulting fees paid to companies that no longer existed. It was a web of deceit, all neatly hidden beneath the HOA's beige surface of civility. But exposure wasn't enough this time. When I had taken down Patricia, the goal had been justice, a public reckoning. Now it was about dismantling the structure that allowed people like her and George to thrive in the first place. I called for a full independent audit. It was risky, such audits were expensive, and the OA's budget was tight. But the community trusted me now. When I explained that transparency required sacrifice, the residents agreed to fund it through a small, temporary special assessment. For the first time, people willingly paid extra dues, not out of fear, but out of hope. The auditors worked quickly. Within weeks, they confirmed everything I had found and more. George's company had received thousands in improper payments. Another former treasurer had quietly reimbursed himself for office supplies that never existed. The HOA's finances had been a feeding trough for anyone with access to the books. When the report was finalized, I scheduled a public meeting and released the entire document online for everyone to see. The clubhouse filled beyond capacity. Neighbors who had once been indifferent now stood shoulder to shoulder, reading every page of the report projected on the wall. The outrage was palpable. People who had lived in the neighborhood for years realized they had been paying for someone else's greed all along. George didn't show up to the meeting. He knew the walls were closing in. The next morning, he tried to sell his house. The listing went up quietly, but word spread fast. By then, the local media had caught wind of the audit, and a new wave of coverage began. Reporters showed up at his driveway. Neighbors recorded footage of moving trucks arriving late at night. Within a week, he was gone, vanished without a word. The HOA was finally free from the shadow of corruption. But the victory didn't feel as satisfying as I expected. Power, no matter who held it, always carried the risk of decay. If I could expose 2 layers of deception in less than a year, who was to say there weren't more hidden beneath? The neighborhood had become a symbol of reform, yet the more transparent we became, the more people realized how fragile the entire system was. It wasn't just about one bad leader or one greedy board member. It was about a culture that rewarded control and conformity over community and trust. So I decided to take things one step further. The HOA wouldn't just be reformed, it would be redefined. The idea was radical: to turn Maplewood Heights from a homeowners association into a cooperative community trust. Instead of being ruled by a board, every resident would have equal voting power on neighborhood matters. Decisions about maintenance, aesthetics, and events would be made through open digital polls. Financial records would be automatically published online. No secrecy, no hierarchy, no more fear. When I presented the idea, it divided the neighborhood. Some people loved it. The dream of true equality, no more authoritarian control. Others feared it. They believed chaos would replace structure. But even those who opposed it couldn't deny that the HOA's reputation had been destroyed. Something had to change. The vote was scheduled for early summer. It would decide the future of Maplewood Heights. If the motion passed, the HOA would dissolve permanently, replaced by the cooperative. In the weeks leading up to the vote, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Flyers appeared on doors, debates erupted on social media, and rumors spread that some of the old board members were quietly organizing against me. They warned that without an HOA, property values would plummet, the streets would decay, and chaos would reign. It was a last-ditch effort to cling to power. But I wasn't backing down. I had seen what unchecked authority could do. I had seen how easily rules meant to protect could be twisted to oppress. On the morning of the vote, the community gathered under clear skies. The meeting was held outdoors, fittingly, in front of the same iconic mailbox that had started it all. People cast their ballots one by one, some hesitant, others smiling. When the results were tallied, the decision was clear. The cooperative had passed. The HOA was officially dissolved. The cheers that followed were unlike anything Maplewood Heights had ever witnessed. For the first time, it felt like a neighborhood truly owned by its residents. Not by a board, not by a president, not by rules written to control. As I stood there watching the celebration, I realized the mailbox wasn't just a symbol of rebellion anymore. It was a monument to change, proof that even the most rigid systems could be reshaped if people stood together. But deep down, I knew one thing. Some people would never forgive me for tearing down what they saw as order. And though the HOA was gone, the people who once thrived under it might not stay silent forever. The peace we had built was fragile, and peace, in neighborhoods like ours, never lasted long. Months passed since the historic vote that dissolved the HOA. The neighborhood that once trembled under rules, fines, and fear was now finding its rhythm in freedom. The lawns grew in their own styles, some perfectly trimmed, others wild with color and personality. The fences were painted in shades that once would have drawn fines, and the air, for the first time in years, felt light. But freedom came with its own challenges. Without the rigid structure of an HOA, there were disagreements, not over violations this time, but over cooperation. Trash collection schedules, maintenance of shared areas, and funding for improvements all became community matters. Where one person saw independence, another saw disorganization. Still, the spirit of unity held strong. The cooperative system worked better than many expected. Residents logged into an online platform to vote on matters, propose ideas, and review expenses in real time. No hidden agendas, no secret meetings, and no penalties for creativity. Yet beneath the harmony, something was stirring. It began quietly, with anonymous complaints posted to the neighborhood forum. Comments criticizing the new system, claiming it was ruining property values. That standards had vanished. At first, people dismissed them as the grumblings of a few who missed the old ways. But soon, the tone shifted. Flyers began appearing again. Not official notices this time, but warnings. They claimed the cooperative was illegal, that the state could step in and reinstate an HOA if the neighborhood was deemed non-compliant with local standards. The language was too familiar to ignore. It was the same rhetoric Patricia used to spread years ago when she wanted control. And while she had left the neighborhood in disgrace, power had a way of finding new hosts. An email came to my inbox one morning. It was unsigned with no return address, just a single sentence. The inspector is coming back. At first, I thought it was a prank. But 2 weeks later, a city vehicle appeared at the entrance to Maplewood Heights. Out stepped a woman in a gray suit, clipboard in hand, scanning the area with a calculating expression. She wasn't from the city council. She was from the State Property and Community Development Office, a department that handled neighborhood zoning and compliance. Somehow, someone had filed a formal complaint about Maplewood Heights, alleging neglect, disrepair, and mismanagement. In truth, the neighborhood had never looked better. There was creativity everywhere. A mosaic walkway by the park, hand-painted fences, gardens filled with color. But to someone looking for uniformity, it might appear chaotic. The inspector toured the area in silence, noting every irregular mailbox, every unconventional yard. She took photos, measured setbacks, and examined the very mailbox that had once been my symbol of defiance. When she left, she said nothing. The report arrived 2 weeks later. It listed multiple inconsistencies with approved community design standards and recommended consideration of reinstating a formal management association. It was, in essence, a threat to bring the HOA back. The community was stunned. We had done everything right, responsibly managed our own affairs, maintained public areas, and paid our shared expenses. Yet now, a faceless bureaucracy threatened to undo everything because we didn't fit into their definition of order. It became clear that someone had orchestrated this. The complaint hadn't been random. Someone had gathered photos, sent documents, and pushed the issue up the chain. And I knew exactly who would benefit from chaos returning: the old guard. Some of the former board members who had disappeared after the audit still owned homes here. They had kept quiet during the transition but never truly accepted the cooperative. With the HOA gone, their power and status had vanished. The state intervention was their way back in. So I prepared for the fight of my life, one last stand to protect what we'd built. I gathered every record we had, financial transparency reports, maintenance logs, cleanup schedules, and before and after photos of improvements. I compiled testimonials from residents describing how the cooperative had improved community life. I even included local media coverage that praised Maplewood Heights as a model for modern community self-governance. When the state scheduled a hearing, I arrived with a binder thick enough to fill a desk. But I wasn't alone. Half the neighborhood came. Parents, retirees, young couples. People who once never attended OA meetings now stood side by side, united not by obligation but by pride. The room was tense. The state officials sat behind a long table, flipping through papers and questioning whether our cooperative had sufficient oversight. I presented the evidence. Calmly, factually, relentlessly. I explained how every vote was public, how every dollar spent was visible, and how every maintenance request was logged transparently. I told them how the absence of an HOA hadn't led to decline, but to creativity and inclusion. Then, one by one, residents stepped forward. They spoke of how they no longer feared retaliation for painting their homes, how neighbors helped each other instead of reporting each other, how community events had become joyful again, not obligations. By the end of the hearing, the officials looked conflicted. The lead inspector leaned forward and asked a final question. If you could bring back the HOA, with fairer leadership, would you want it? The silence was heavy. And then, like a wave, the answer spread across the room, not through words, but through the quiet shaking of heads. No one wanted to go back. 2 weeks later, the decision arrived. The state had denied the reinstatement request. The cooperative stood. Maplewood Heights was officially recognized as a self-governing community trust, the first of its kind in the county. The old board members vanished again, this time for good. Their influence faded into the past, just like the fear they once commanded. And as for me, I finally stepped down. I had led long enough. The whole point of what I'd built was that no one person should ever hold that much power again. The community elected a rotating committee of volunteers to handle routine matters, and the rest was left to collective vote. I kept the landmark mailbox as it was bold, beautiful, and symbolic. The vines that once climbed its base had now grown into a small garden of their own, wild but thriving. Every passerby knew its story, the spark that turned rebellion into revolution. On quiet evenings, I'd walk past it and remember the years of conflict, the battles fought in driveways and boardrooms, the sleepless nights spent defending something that mattered more than appearances' freedom. Maplewood Heights wasn't perfect. It never would be. But perfection had always been the lie the HOA sold us. What we had now was real, messy, colorful, alive. And in that imperfection, we had found peace.